Good afternoon and welcome to Minneapolis Institute of Art. And in the spirit of the season, we all want to wish you a warm and happy new year. So keep warm. This is a Saturday lecture. The Friends are trying something a little different. We're having a few lectures at different times and different days from 11 o'clock Thursday, just to see who comes out. And I really am glad to see all of you on a Saturday afternoon. It's so brutal out, just so brutal. I'm Boyd Ratchey, the president of the Friends of the Institute. And today's lecture is funded generously by the Mark and Mary Goff Fiterman Fund. And they fund all of our lectures this year. And it's a pleasure to have them. Curtis Erickson couldn't make it today, but we are ever grateful to her. I'm going to keep going for a while. The Friends welcome you, and if you're a Friends member, I ask you to renew at the table right in the front, or at the front desk, or on the internet. And if you're not a Friends member, I'm going to be reciting all the things we're doing this month, or next month in February, and ask you to join the Friends. First of all, our next Fiterman lecture is Bisa Butler. She's a quilter from Chicago and an artist. And that's at 6 p.m. on the 8th. Yes, and that'll be a delight. If you can, please do attend. The next two events are on the same day, the 16th. The Friends Only Local Art Tour are touring the Russian Museum of Art. And I think you know where that is on 35. Let's hear it for the Russians. Okay. What makes this tour so wonderful is it's 3 live current artists, and one of them will be there on the tour to talk about his art. He's a Ukrainian. That should be an interesting tour. Then the next thing on the same day is the book club, which always meets in the Friends office. And if you want to attend that, you'll need to sign up next week when the Friends office is open. And it's A Choice of Weapons by Gordon Parks. We have a photographic exhibit right now of his art, and it's a marvel. If you just walk through, it'll catch your eye. And I'm thinking that the book club will catch your eye and your mind. So please do attend if you can. Finally, Art in Bloom is our big event for the Friends, and it begins Thursday the 25th and finishes Sunday the 28th. I hope you'll all attend. The weather will be better, that's a promise. The theme piece is by Christine Belcourt at Métis, and she's alive. She's an Indigenous artist living in southern Canada. And the theme is, it's a delicate balance of the environment, of life itself. The piece that we've chosen is up in room gallery 301, the most northeast on the 3rd floor. It's a wonderful piece, and I would recommend that you go there. Now we're going to turn to the reason you're here, not to hear me. Doug Argue, an artist trained in Bemidji, and then he's moved on to New York City. I imagine that's an improvement, at least for weather. And he'll be introduced by, do I have your first? I've got to get your, Nicole Sukop. And she has a marvelous resume. And I just told her that she's presented a number of exhibits here. My favorite was one where I would, whether it was on my tours or not, I always walked by it. And students from the third grade to seniors at the University of Minnesota loved the pieces. It was Guerrilla Girls. Some of you may remember it. Wonderful, wonderful exhibit. Nicole?
Thank you, Boyd. As Boyd said, my name is Nicole Iasukup, and I'm the Assistant Curator of Contemporary Art and the Coordinator for the Minnesota Artist Exhibition Program. And no, I can't say that 5 times fast. And also, Boyd and I did not plan on dressing so alike today, but I have to say, I always take my fashion cues from him. Welcome on this chilly afternoon. I am so honored to be presenting and introducing Doug Argue, excuse me, and then I go ahead and put my foot right in my mouth. Doug first emerged onto the art scene in the early 1980s, a tumultuous, rebellious moment in Minneapolis history. His sensational, larger-than-life paintings stood apart from his peers, the intense, vibrant works loaded with expression that tapped into his memories and depths of his imagination. From there, I dare say the works got bigger, louder, and maybe even more intimately personal. I'll let Doug talk about his career, because after all, that's why you're here. You're not here to hear me ramble on about how brilliant Doug is, although I could do that for most of this afternoon. Over the last 4 decades, Doug has been the subject of countless exhibitions, most recently at the Weisman Art Museum at the University of Minnesota, which is where I first encountered his work. As a student, I remember walking in and seeing the now iconic rows of chickens. But it wasn't the subject matter that struck me. It was that somebody who lived in Bemidji could go on to have their work shown in an institution. Now, as the coordinator for the Minnesota Arts Exhibition Program, that is a sentiment that I carried on throughout my career, a career that probably wouldn't have happened without you, Doug. So thank you. Now, before we go too far ahead, I should also point out that his work is held in numerous public and private collections, including the Port Authority World Trade Center, where if you go to Doug's website, you might see a very famous couple posing in front of Beyonce. The Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Walker Art Center, and of course, like I said, the Weisman. And there's a few others in there, but we're in Minneapolis, so let's shout out. He has received multiple awards, including a Pollock-Krasner Foundation grant, the Rome Prize, but who's counting? So before I bring Doug to the stage, I just want to reinforce a few items that Boyd mentioned. We'll have a Q&A from the audience, so prepare your questions while Doug is presenting. But when you do have your question, I do ask that you wait for the mic to arrive. We're recording this, and it makes it so much easier, especially for those of us in the audience that might have auditory issues, that if you wait for the mic, we can all hear you. It would be great. Then after the talk today, there's going to be a series of tours, and you can meet us out in the rotunda by the artworks where old main entrance used to be. And please join us, because we'll be ending in the print study room to see Doug's works, a private moment with Doug's works, y'all. So without further ado, Mr. Argue, please join me, everybody, in welcoming Doug to the stage.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Boyd. Thank you, Josie. Thanks to the friends of the Minneapolis Art Institute. My sister, who's here, has been doing some research into our genealogy, and discovered that we actually go back to the Plymouth Bay colony in part of our ancestry. So we're pilgrims. So today I'm going to wind together a little bit of my ancestry, my personal history, the history of my work, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about something that happened to me in my hometown last year at my Weisman Museum exhibition, which is I had some work censored and my book was banned from my survey exhibition. This led me to do a little research into book banning. The first banned book in America actually happened in the Pilgrims. It was by the Puritans, not by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they banned a book by Thomas Morton, who did a satire on the Puritans. And if you know anything about the Puritans, there's probably a lot of room for satire. I'm actually going to read this little bit because my friend Claude, who worked on my book, is a journalist. I don't normally like to read, but a journalist that likes details right. So I'm going to do this quick. In 2020, the Italian publisher Schiro brought out a survey book about me and my work titled Doug Argue Letters to the Future, a title that Claude came up with, but that the museum also used for its exhibition. It was edited by longtime Twin Cities journalist Claude Peck. It has about 175 color images, guest essays, and an interview. As the Weisman had offered to do a show in concert with the book, it contains a director's foreword by longtime Weisman director Lindell King and an essay by the show's guest curator Liz Armstrong. COVID delayed the show until June 23, and Lindell had retired by the time the exhibition opened. Here I am signing 2 days before the opening 150 books that the museum bought, and at the request of the museum staff. They bought these books for about $10,000 when it came out in 2020 and had them on hand all that time, and even mailed a complimentary copy to all of those who had donated money to the exhibition. I was also told by the chief curator, Diane Mullen, that copies of the book would be placed all around the exhibition to supplement the show, as we didn't have much space for the exhibition and many works were left out. This book is in many library collections already, including the Met Museum, the Yale Library, and many, many others. It's also been available online at Amazon and Target and many other places. And here I am doing a talk at my opening, and at the end of my talk, I told the 150 people or so that were there that they could go find the book in the exhibition or in the bookstore, but it wasn't there. And nobody told me that it had been banned by the museum's director, Alejandra Peña Gutierrez. And as my way, this led me to start researching banned books. And one of the first banned books in America was James Joyce Ulysses. It was banned for obscenity. And in reading about it, it basically came down to there was a group of men who felt like they needed to protect women from the sex scenes in the book. And on the other side, fighting against the ban was primarily women. There was a woman who hired the lawyer that fought the ban, and a woman was the first publisher of the book. And this is often the case when books get banned. People say they're protecting people, and the people who are being protected don't necessarily want the patronizing protection that they're getting. And the judge's ruling was interesting too. First he said, if you know James Joyce, this might be kind of funny, the language was so obscure that the average person wouldn't understand what was going on. And secondly, that it had artistic merit. And what he meant by that was that it wasn't pure pornography. And when you look at the books that are currently being banned today, all around the country, there's an epidemic of book banning. When I look at it, I see people trying to tell real stories about their real lives, things that are going on, and trying to be honest about it. And you get primarily LGBTQ books, books that mention race, books that mention abortion, and books about family. And then the people who are going around trying to ban it are not people who are describing real lives. They're people who have a kind of prescriptive view of the world. And they want to tell people how to live without actually knowing about their lives and who they are. So you have people working hard to describe what their life is, and then you have people who just want to tell people what to do, basically. Oops, did I go too? Here come the argues. We come in through Canada, and it's a motley looking crew. We go into North Dakota, but we do have a family crest. And we're on the Great Plains. And then about 40 years later, I'm about 70% Norwegian. We come into sort of the plains of Minnesota in the 1860s with the arrival of most of the settlers here. And you notice I threw in Munch. Those of you with a sharp eye, I consider him an ancestor. We've had ancestors that have served in almost every single war this country's ever had, which I think was an interesting thing I found in my research. And I hope one of the things they were fighting for was personal freedom and freedom of speech. This house was on Ancestry. I'm not sure if it's a real house, but you get the idea. A lot of houses on the prairie and in settlements, there were ancestors who also lived in towns and were judges. And here you see the house I grew up in, all 8 of us, and you see my mom heading up the stairs, who is undoubtedly the most amazing person I've ever known. I went to Hancock Elementary School. It's renamed now Hamlin. And around Thanksgiving time, we'd get a bunch of colored paper, and we would do these great little cutouts of my ancestors with the cute little hats and the nice little belts. And there's usually an indigenous person and a turkey. And this is basically the education about the relationship between the Europeans and the indigenous people that I got all the way through college. My dad liked to walk around in the woods and in the prairies and identify plants and figure out the Latin names for them. And I would tag along, but I would get bored. And when I was in 5th grade, from memory, I did this drawing of the prairie of grass and milkweed seeds floating through the air. I went to Wilson Junior High School and St. Paul Central, and there my passion was sports. And I credit this period of time with giving me the endurance and the discipline to go into a studio by myself every day and work. And my senior year, I got a really bad injury. I couldn't wrestle anymore. And I took all that energy that I had been putting into sports, and I started making art. And I also saw my first art exhibition, which was this Picasso show at the Walker Art Center. And it made a huge impression on me. And I enjoyed the work, but he's constantly changing. And so even then I thought of this idea that you could trace his life through his work. Like his work wasn't just every individual piece, but the arc of his life, you could understand a life lived by seeing his work. And that inspired me. And I have always kept that in the back of my head. I did go to Bemidji State University. I grew up in St. Paul. I had a great teacher there named Marley Call. And the way he taught me is he gave me a key. And I worked all the time. And we would sit around and talk about the work. He never told me what to do. And I did all of these drawings, and I worked all the time. And when I was at Bemidji, I also did lots of other things. I did printmaking class. I did photography. I did ceramics. And I took art history courses. And the most influential art history course I took was in Asian painting. And what really struck me, and it influenced every large-scale piece I did, was how the image looked like it could keep going off of the picture plane in every direction. Like it could just keep going. And if there were figures, the figures blended into the landscape. They weren't like a big in the center kind of starring in a movie figure. After I was in Bemidji for 2 years, it was the end of the academic year, And Marley came and got me, and I had a phone call, and the phone call was that my brother Scott had been killed in a car accident. And I couldn't go back to Bemidji after that. It was hard for me. So I transferred to the University of Minnesota, and I had been used to working by myself. I was taking sheets of aluminum and kicking them and bending them and painting them with car enamel. And I ended up in a painting class that had a semicircle of people with easels around it. And it was, I think Plato, a bust of Plato in a wine bottle, and everybody was sketching it. And I didn't fit in, and then the painting teachers didn't want me around. But there was a great teacher there whose name was Wayne Potraz, and he invited me to come down to the foundry, and I worked down there even though I didn't have credits. And there was another great teacher there named Susan Lucy, and I worked down there the year I was there. But I didn't have any money, my family didn't have any money, and I decided to take the little bit of money I was making from my job. I worked in a hospital, and get my own studio. And I rented a studio in this building in Lower Town, St. Paul. That was a building that was chock full of great artists. And there's our local bar, the Gopher Bar. And at my survey show, somebody said that they had just been there and the bar was still there and it still looked the same. I did it from memory, so I guess I have a pretty good memory. That landlord wanted to convert it into expensive lofts, and so we all got the boot. And I ended up on Block E here. In that warehouse, the curator, Liz Armstrong, had visited my studio and offered me a show at the Walker Art Center. And I finished that show here above Hot Licks Records and Rifle Sport, a gallery. Although the Picasso exhibition was the first real exhibition I ever saw, I always came here to the MIA, and then I would go back to my studio, and from my imagination, I would just recreate paintings. My philosophy has always been that there's a stimulus in the outside world, and then my brain does something to it, and it creates my reality. So that's why I usually work from my imagination. And here we have one of the greatest paintings in the world. I've seen a lot of paintings, and Lucretia is certainly one of the greatest paintings in the world, and it's a suicide painting. And if you look in Lucretia's eyes, you can have that feeling like she's in between life and death. And my painting of that isn't a suicide painting, but my brother had just died, and I was thinking about the fine line between life and death. One minute he was here and the other minute he was gone. And this painting of mine got censored out of my Weisman Museum show because they said that if somebody saw it, they might commit suicide. And I would just say that the Lucretia painting, I think, was first bought by the MIA here in 1932. And I don't think it's ever been taken down. And I don't think anyone's ever committed suicide after looking at the painting. I think when you make those kind of choices, you need to have some evidence, especially when you're at a university. Here we have the great painting by Picasso of Guernica. It's a painting of the bombing during their Civil War. You see on the left, the woman wailing and her dead baby. And then you see these school children who are not being harmed by this picture. They're learning about life. They're going to be able to make wiser decisions from it. Somehow the MIA got this great Caravaggio at the same time that my exhibition was up. I'd seen it many times in a palazzo in Rome, but of course I and thousands of other people here came and saw it. My painting next to it also got censored out of my Weisman Museum show for violence. And what I was thinking about, I'm in my 20s, I'm reading Nietzsche, and he has this idea that morality can't exist without religion. And I was kind of poo-pooing that idea. I had the feeling that people have morality in them. And even though my piece is somewhat cartoony, they censored it from the exhibition. I also think there's a level of naivety about what university students are actually watching. what actually it takes up their lives. At the time, I was just working from my imagination, which Nicole implied. I would do a snowman or something and then create a world around it with my imagination. And I had met the art dealer Todd Boakley, and we did, I think, about 4 shows or 5 shows every year. And I really liked working with Todd. This piece is owned by Madeline Betch. Madeline has been supporting me since I was in my 20s, and I'm very, very grateful to her for that. When I went to work in the hospital, I often worked nights, and I rode the MTA, and you would see strange things on the buses. So I hitchhiked to New York, and I went to the museums. I saw Mademoiselle d'Avignon and all kinds of paintings at MoMA and the Met. But when I got back, I did this little painting of a park from memory. I sat and had a slice of pizza, and New York has all those small little parks. When I was in Minneapolis, the riverfront wasn't a pleasant place. People would throw their refrigerators, they would dump their cars, they would dump their trash everywhere. And so this was an environmental painting, and I just want to say it's nice to see that something good could happen. They cleaned it up, they made a very nice park. My job in the hospital, I helped with autopsies. I did CPR when people's hearts stopped. But mostly what I did is I lifted people in and out of bed. Then my Walker Art Center show came, I finished it, and after that I decided I really needed to travel, and I spent a lot of time traveling. And Michelangelo painted these male figures in the Last Judgment, and nude as the day they were born. And the figure on the right, that cardinal, decided that nudity wasn't good, and he hired a different artist to cover up all their private parts with little pieces of cloth. And as his revenge, I'm only just saying this for people who censor stuff, Michelangelo put him in hell in the bottom right-hand corner of this painting with donkey ears and a snake biting his penis, and he's been that way for like 500 years. This is a painting from the Louvre. Veronese got into a lot of trouble when he did this painting because the Inquisition knew the Bible inside and out, and they knew that there were no Germans or dwarves at the Last Supper. And he was going to be condemned for this painting, and then he had an aha light bulb moment and changed the name. And then the Inquisition was free to pursue Galileo for coming up with that horrible idea that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Here we are at the Louvre. I show this because the palaces in Europe are based a lot on single point perspective, and they very much influenced the painting of chickens that Nicole mentioned. I ended up in Venice. I loved this painting, and I looked at it for hours. It's one of these things where I learned to love the scale and the idea of what I wanted to do with scale, which is when you're standing there and looking at it, you feel like you fall into it, like you're a part of it, like you're inside of the whole thing. And I looked at this piece for hours. I went to Mexico City. I looked at all the murals there, and I really loved this one. I found it deeply mysterious. It's an Orozco painting. And I was standing there looking at it, having this kind of mystical moment, and then a bell rang, and all these children came running out of the classrooms. It's actually a part of a school. And I really loved that idea that these mural paintings are in public places and people see them all the time. You could theorize that it's damaging these children, but it's not in any way at all. And here you have the great History of Mexico by Diego Rivera. I liked the politics of these murals. I liked the history of them. And when I came back to Minneapolis, I got a studio in Northeast Minneapolis, and I decided I wanted to do a history painting that had something to do with where I was from. Most of my ancestors were from the Great Plains, from that area. I grew up walking through the plains with my father, and I thought one of the most significant things that had happened on the plains was the massacre of all the buffalo. And I didn't want to dramatize it. I wanted to show the after effect. And you can see the influence of the Asian painting, how I want it to feel like it keeps going off the sides forever. And then at that time, I realized I didn't really have much knowledge about history, and so I started reading. And one of the things that I read about was the conquistadors and how they would chop off indigenous people's limbs to punish them. And I was horrified by this, of course, and I was horrified too that in school nobody ever taught me any of these things, that I never heard about it. And it came up again recently because after George Floyd was murdered, a lot of indigenous people in New Mexico, where this Onate was from, rose up to try and get his statue taken down because they thought of him as an oppressor. And I love this story. This is probably better than any piece that I did. Somebody went and actually cut off the conquistador's foot. And I assume he was standing there for 20 years without a foot. And if you remember the little paper cutout that I did in the beginning and said that that was basically my education and that my education had been whitewashed, I didn't know anything about massacres at Sand Creek or Wounded Knee, and at this time I was reading that stuff. And I did the paper cutout to point back to that kind of naive education I got, and I was angry about my education being whitewashed. Of course, I was horrified by the atrocities too. And the day after my Weisman Museum opening, Alejandra, the director, called me, and we had a very brief conversation, and all she said to me about banning the book was the conquistador. So I assume it's this piece. I don't know what it is about the conquistador. She never explained it. But this is the reason that the book wasn't in the museum. It's quite a horrible thing. I don't know if you can understand it, to have something banned. It affected me horribly, and you know. I traveled all the way down the Nile, up and down the Nile actually at the time when I was traveling too. And this temple is in the southern part of Egypt. And around the feet of Ramesses in this temple, you see children. You also see what they called as minor wives. And this influenced the next series I did. Around this time, my son Madison was born. I couldn't really focus on doing a large painting like that. And I started doing monoprints. The monoprints evolved into these father and son pieces. But you can see how that scale from the Ramesses sculpture affected the idea of the painting. Sometimes I'm kind of the son, sometimes I'm the father. It's about generations. And I'm glad that this show was here at the MIA, because I was thinking about generations, but I was also thinking about generations in terms of art. You know, if there's no art from past generations or no writing or anything, it's just a void. One generation dies out and then there's nothing left. And so it makes that kind of transition from generation to generation, even if you want to rebel against it or you don't like it or there's something wrong with it, it creates a continuum through time instead of abrupt endings. When I looked at all of my father's plant identification books and stuff, it reminded me at this point I had seen a bunch of Albrecht Dürer's, that's his rhinoceros, and the humanist drawings that they did that were studies of plants and animals. And I loved those pieces. And my dad did lots of drawings of pollen grains because that's what he studied, very, very detailed. And I thought, when I have a good visual memory and I could remember bits and pieces of the plants and animals. So I thought I would just do imaginary scientific studies. And the words are just whatever came into my head. So they're a little bit like Rorschach tests. And I came up with these, and the kind of takeaway that I got from my dad, you know, because what he actually studied was evolution. And of course, pollen carries genetic material. And then every living thing is different. Everything is a variant. Everything's always changing. And so that's what sort of stuck in my head from that. Here's that work in my survey show. You can see Liz had to work really creatively to hang the works. And you see 5 of those pieces. When they were originally hung, somebody at the museum walked by and thought that they looked like a swastika. So they actually, I looked at it, I didn't see it, and they actually made Liz rehang the pieces. And you can see here how the palaces of Europe influenced this painting with single point perspective. But instead of paintings, I put up chickens. And the main idea, thinking about that idea that every living thing is a variant, every living thing is different, was that every single one of these chickens had to be different. That was the main objective. Of course, when you got down to the last 2 inches, it was impossible. And this piece is owned by the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And I thought of this at a period of time when there was the first personal computers, and the internet just started. You would plug your phone line into the back of your computer. And then there were these things called CD-ROMs where you could get 100,000 books and nobody could read them all. And all of this information I found kind of overwhelming. And so here I am trying to push out past the edges again to infinity in every direction. And then I also read a short story by the author Borges from South America called The Library of Babel. And he describes a library that goes to infinity in every direction. And it's a really amazing story. And the basic idea is that you have particulates, which are letters, and any person can organize them in a way to make a new book. So every person can always make a new book to infinity. And I thought that, that's really the way, in a way, atoms work that way and chromosomes work that way. And you get variation on mixing particulates, not necessarily by everything being brand new all the time. At this point, I was lucky enough to win the Rome Prize. I lived in Rome for a year. I did this piece of leaves. Again, all different, again, pushing to the edges. But when I was working on that painting of Dead Buffalo, I had an experience that never repeated. I turned around and my dead brother, Scott, was standing there watching me paint. And we had a conversation, and I asked him what it was like to be dead. And he said he couldn't feel a breeze on his face anymore, and he missed it. And then he told me I had to live for both of us now, and I'm like, yeah, thanks, thanks for that. And so this was an elegy for my brother. It's if you see it, it's owned by the Minnesota Museum of Art. They had it up for a long time. The idea is you're supposed to be able to feel a breeze blowing through these leaves when you look at it. There's my brother Scott and me. We were 1 year apart, but I was a preemie and I was a little behind. One of the things we did when I was at the American Academy in Rome is we traveled through the whole of the country of Syria. We did a big loop. We saw all the great archaeological things, and it was quite amazing. But one of the things that stood out to me was there was no billboards with Coca-Cola or real estate agents. It was all one guy, Hassaf Assad, everywhere. And like I went and got a shave, and it was him in a picture of him. Even the graffiti, there was sprayed graffiti in alleys, that was his face. And when I was working on the chickens, people had started coming in and picking out their favorite chicken. And I thought it was funny. I thought they were all different, but how could there be a favorite? And then a few people picked the same one. And then I offered to do portraits of it. And so then I thought, well, we have an infinite number of chickens and we have a chosen one. And I started thinking about Andy Warhol and Chairman Mao and like they're the chosen one. So I did my big dictator chickens based on all of that. And they were bought by the art collector Jerry Kafestian, and we showed the large chicken painting, the painting to infinity, and the individual chickens in Armenia. And I still like that image. I don't necessarily like art that tries too hard to please me. And this was a little goofy. I thought of it as kind of Don Quixote. It was cockeyed, but it had a crown, so it was kind of royalty. And I did a series of these where I changed the background, and then the background changed the meaning of the painting instead of changing the actual character of the painting. And then I read that there was a Tyrannosaurus rex they found, and they were able to get DNA from it, and its closest living relative was a chicken. And I think a lot of people who study this know that The dinosaurs didn't necessarily all go extinct. A lot of them evolved into birds, the millions of birds that you see around us now. And so the words that I gave my chicken was, "I ain't no chicken." Because he knew his background. He went back to the Puritans or something, and he was proud of it. And then what I did is I started thinking about these letters that I was using to give it language, more like atoms or chromosomes. And you see, I took the word dinosaur on the nature and nurture piece, and I took it apart into its pieces where you can see the letters. And then the figure disappeared, and there was just the letters left. And I did a whole series of these, moving the letters around and experimenting with them. And then I ended up with this painting, Genesis, where I took the letters from the book of Genesis, and I did what I called atomize them. You can't read it, they're individual letters. And I made a big bang out of it. And then I put it through a redshift. And the word Genesis, of course, means a new beginning. And in a way, all the letters escaped from that book painting. But also, I was thinking about how every generation can take language, can take the building blocks of culture and create the world that they want, create the world that they need. And that was the basic idea I was thinking of. But I was also still thinking that everything had to be different. So I never repeated these letters. And you can see on some of these details, these letters, a lot of them are smaller than 1/8 of an inch, but they're all different. And these are the works that ended up in the Freedom Tower, the One World Trade Center. And it's at this point, too, that I moved to New York. I had been in San Francisco for about 10 years after I was in Rome. And I did a bunch of these pieces, mostly thinking about them as kind of atoms, as particulates. But then my thinking started to change. I started thinking about the letters as creating movement, making a feeling of flux over the top, but you could still identify them as letters. I read somewhere that the same template that you have in your brain to identify somebody is used to sort of identify a letter. So I like that idea where you walk up, you don't know what it is, and then you can see that it's like a letter. And so I was thinking about movement and change and how things are always changing. And I was using the letters to bring that point across. And then I got a show as a part of the Venice Biennale. And I did a piece that was a red brick wall. If you've been to Venice, it's full of red brick walls. And I thought that my two favorite painters, Titian and Tintoretto, my two favorite Venetian painters, probably were looking at the same red brick wall I was, or something very similar. And I thought that there was something timeless about it. And I hung my red brick wall painting on a red brick wall, which wasn't in a palazzo, but in a kitchen of a palazzo. And the most influential painter to me in Venice was Titian. Titian is known as kind of the first painter of light. He used brushstroke. If you think about Michelangelo earlier, he's about line and form. And then you have Titian, but he's about light. And so I did this painting as my homage to him and light. And then the last way I thought about the letters was, it's kind of unbelievable, but anti-Semitism was pretty strong. The only thing that Einstein won the Nobel Prize for was understanding that in a material, let's say it's steel, because it looks solid, there's actually a lot of space and the atoms are packed in. But the atoms are vibrating and moving and hitting each other. And when they do that, even their electrons come flying out. So I started stacking a letter on top of a letter on top of a letter, trying to get the feeling of that kind of energy. So the choices in this weren't necessarily aesthetic. I wasn't aiming for a cute little view. I was wanting that kind of energy. And then I realized when I was talking to people that people didn't see the past paintings that I loved the same way I did. And so not only was the future in flux and changing, but now I had to deal with a past that was changing and in flux. And my idea was if I floated letters over these pieces, they were really hard to do. I had to train myself how to paint like an old Renaissance master. But then I would float letters over the top that looked like rain. It would obscure them. They would be like a veil over the top. But the idea was that I would put them in motion. Like they weren't mile markers to the past, but their interpretation was open to new interpretation, that they were changing, that ideas about them were changing. As time went on, I did a show of those at Mark Strauss Gallery. And then for about 10 years, I had been doing like, I don't know how many stencils of letters, like millions. And the pandemic hit and I'm like, I'm not doing any more letters. And like in the beginning, when I first did that painting with the snowman I showed you, and I would just start with my imagination, I went back to that and I did a series of 15 kind of underwater pieces with, you know, seahorses singing opera. And then after January 6th, I did this piece of the fish school. And you can see how I would like it. It's like the leaves. It's like all my other pieces. The space is kind of isotropic, but it pushes past the edges. There's no big central figure. They're all individuals. They're all different. And then I thought, well, I did a whole series of these. I thought, well, if I floated them over a kind of color field painting like a Mark Rothko, there would be a whole different emotional quality to them. And then I went to this great show at the Met Museum of the British artist Cecily Brown, and I noticed that she was painting over the top of inkjet prints. And she was printing out old masterpieces and doing her beautiful loose versions on the top. But I thought, well, if the past is in flux and the future is in flux, we don't know what's going to happen. I could put my own past in flux and just start printing one of my pieces over the top of another, or have a family reunion. And then I printed out some pictures of the Hudson River School paintings. In New York, we had a few days last year where the smoke was so strong we couldn't breathe. So they're climate change pieces, but also after George Floyd, tradition was under fire. And one of the earliest American traditions was the Hudson River School. And so I was thinking about that. And then I also enjoyed that I painted around these gentlemen sort of walking through the country as if nothing's happening. I understand if people want to, get lost in art and have it as an escape, but I also think there's a lot of room for more challenging work, for people's individual stories, for their life stories, for works of art that challenge, politics, that challenge aesthetic limits, that challenge our ideas of what art are. And right now in this country, things are getting banned by the left and by the right. And one of the biggest sort of centrist issues for most of the history of this country is that we had freedom of speech. And it's being attacked from all sides. And I think that we don't know what the future is going to bring. We don't know what works of art are going to help people make wise decisions. We don't know what works of art are going to be interesting to people. And we have to stop banning stuff. We have to stop censoring stuff. And I just want to congratulate the Minneapolis Art Institute for, I think they're like a beacon on the hill in terms of the classical work they show. It can be very challenging and cause discussion, but that's one of the reasons art exists. And in that light, if you haven't seen this show by Jim Denemy, I knew him a little bit. His work is very challenging. They're very beautiful. They're very good. But it's contemporary work, so the MIA continues even now to be a kind of beacon for freedom of expression.
Thank you. Could you talk about the challenges of what is entailed in making those very large paintings with extraordinary numbers of details?
Well,
how do you do it?
Well, I think in the beginning I was a little bit crazy because, when I did that painting of the chickens, it took almost 3 years. And I worked on it every day. And I didn't have any money. I got a McKnight grant, I got a Jerome grant, and there's some money, but they're not a lot of money. And I was sleeping on the floor of my studio. And I had no idea if anybody would buy it or if it was any good. And I would do about this much every day, and then it gets painted twice before it gets finished. So back then, I just had more confidence than any living person should have. And I just did it. And making art for me now sometimes is more challenging because there's more pressures. You know, like in a way, the art world has changed. These god-awful, you know, you go to Miami to these art fairs and stuff, and it's not about art. So it's a nightmare, but you have to do it if you're going to survive. So those things are more of a challenge to me. I love making paintings. I still do.
I saw your exhibition at the Weisman, and it was wonderful. I had no idea the backstory of the censorship. I actually ordered your book online from your website. And
Thank you.
it's lovely, highly recommend it. I'm wondering if you can talk more about the censorship and whether this is a pattern that's developing or something that you've experienced or heard about in the past?
Well, I know it's a pattern in general. You know, I have a friend, Andrew Solomon, who wrote a book called Far from the Tree, and in it he talks about his extended family, and he doesn't have a nuclear family. It's a very complicated, interesting family, and you would expect this, but his book got completely banned in China, but now it's also censored and blacklisted in Texas. And there's a big pattern where it's not a nuclear family, so there are people who believe somehow they're threatened by this book that describes the way his family works. And there's groups now that spend all their time trying to ban books from schools. And so that's definitely a pattern. In my case, it's only happened to me this time, but it really, I was severely depressed by the whole thing. It causes a lot of self-doubt. It shouldn't, but it does. And you sort of wonder what you did. It's really, I wouldn't recommend it. It's definitely a pattern in this country, and it's not just the left, it's the right. Trying to cancel people is no better than trying to cancel people's books. Just let people speak, decide what you think about it all by yourself. You're grown up.
Hey Doug, how you doing?
Good.
Mike Riano, welcome back to the Twin Cities.
Thank you.
I think we crossed paths in the mid-80s at the Walker Arts Center. And that brief time when maybe you were working as a guard, many good conversations and great lecture. But was there any work, because I think when we were both there was some very big shows that we worked, that when you were working as a guard at the Walker and you spent so much time in a room with the work, if you recall any works that really kind of stayed with you. I can't remember some of the artists there with the boats.
I never worked as a guard at the Walker. I never worked as a guard. But
okay. I must have crossed paths with you then in a different way, but
yeah.
I never talked with you about art.
I mean, the Walker collection is pretty remarkable. I think they were one of the first museums to buy a Julie Meritou painting, which is an amazing painting. And of course, she's gone on to become a huge international star. So, but they, you know, at that time, they also had the great Rauschenberg piece up, the great Rosenquist piece up. I always loved the, what's her, the woman, not the guy, Mangold, her beautiful little window piece. I'm better at remember pieces than
Sylvia.
Sylvia, that piece is quite fantastic too. They have a great collection.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thank you. Doug, when you finished, I was thinking about one of my favorite movies, Shane, which closes with Shane riding off, Doug going away, and the little kid saying, "Don't go, Shane, don't go." We know you have to go, Doug. Thank you. And we are pleased to be in Minnesota. And let's all think for ourselves. Thank you, Doug.